There we go. So, hello.
Hi. Hey.
To start off with, would you like to say your name and where you are?
I am John Lyons, and I am in Albania, in Tirana, the capital of Albania.
Hmm, okay. And the first big question is, who are you? Who are you as a person and as a human being?
Wow.
And that can be values, passions, qualities about yourself, or whatever you'd like.
Okay. I think foremost what immediately came for me was I'm a searcher. I've spent most of my life looking, searching, trying to put things in perspective and make sense of what it is that we're doing together. And I say that relationally. I mean, there's always the issue of what I'm doing with my own life, but it seems to be a much bigger question than that. Outside of that, I'm a dialoguer, I'm a communicator. One of the only things that has kept me moving through life is the ability to connect, the prospects for connecting, or the opportunities to connect, the potential of connecting. That's probably the best word.
Hmm.
On a professional basis, I've been an international educator for a lot longer than I want to think about, probably about 30 years. I'm an author, I write poetry, I run groups. This is one of the reasons that I have a renewed interest in Gestalt therapy, is I've developed some models of intercultural group communication, intercultural group dialogue around issues of power and privilege in particular. And I think this is an ideal time. It's probably a little overdue to begin to voice these kinds of interest in the Gestalt community. And there's some of that happening already, by the way, but I would like to be part of that. Ergo, that's why I'm speaking. One of the reasons I'm speaking to you today is to maybe explore that a little bit.
Yeah, that is interesting in terms of international and intercultural power and privilege. Those are
Yeah,
some
yeah.
of my favorite areas to get
Ooh,
into. So,
yeah, it's universal. Unfortunately, it doesn't go
mhm.
away as we shift locations. The fact that I'm a middle-aged white male, that is the first thing that gets unpacked anytime that I go to a foreign country, particularly if it's in the South, the global South.
Mhm. Yes,
And
you've
and
noticed
the,
that, have you?
yeah, I've noticed that.
Hmm. Okay. So, about yourself, would you say that there's anything you'd add in terms of your values? Is there a core value that you sort of orient around in your life?
This is always kind of catchy and loaded set of dice, but I would hope it's receptivity. Um, Maybe too much receptivity to some degree. I tend to operate on an open system, um, and so I'm always taking in new information, taking in new stimulation, taking in new voices, and processing. That's an ongoing process for me. So that's my point of departure. That's pretty much where I function. That's my home, is receptivity. And then second to that is the feedback you get from that receptivity, which may not always be welcome, but that's called communication in most circles, or being communicative, or dialogue, or relationship. So personally, if I combine those two, the receptivity we hope that's genuine and interested and present, with the response that's always kind of right on the edge for me, I tend to be very responsive, then that pretty much wraps me up. I don't have much more to say about myself than that on
Hmm.
an intra-psychic level, if that makes any sense, in the interior.
I am curious though, because you're talking about power and privilege, and I'm wondering how you hold the critical part of yourself along with that receptivity, because otherwise it's just like open confluence.
Yeah, well, that's in the response. I mean, one of the things I'm always doing is gauging, and I've become probably far too politicized in my personal life, but I'm always gauging the social distances that exist around axes, organizational axes of power, privilege, race, class, and gender. So that's a constant feedback loop for me. And that's where we get into the relational for me.
Mm.
So you as a woman, you as a female, a little younger than me, maybe perhaps, um, whatever. This conversation always has that tinge of how are we relating on that level, and is that something that becomes figure for us? Is that something that's figural, that emerges from the ground? And many times it doesn't, and I love it when that doesn't happen. But we bounce up against that all the time. That's one of the contact areas. That's one of the boundaries that consistently comes up for me anyway, because maybe I'm overly sensitive, or aware of those kinds of issues.
Hmm.
So to answer your question, that's where I begin to become less receptive and more emotive, perhaps, or more analytical, or more calculated, or more exploratory.
Hmm.
I hope that
Okay.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Sure.
So you said that was it for you personally, but I'm going to ask a few more questions. One of them is it's a little bit about your history, and I'm wondering what comes to mind as a particular event or as a set of circumstances that you would say have had a large impact on you.
Yeah, there are probably several. The one that I always kind of ground myself in terms of changes I've made in my life, there was a period of time that I was young and wild and not sure what I was doing. I was involved in what we used to call a project for economically disadvantaged youth. I was a client in that. And this was a wonderful program because they were actually paying me to stay in school. And I was a high school student. And so one of the only reasons I would get up in the morning and make it to school, because that's the last place I wanted to be at 16 or 17, was I knew that it would get me some money and I would be able to maybe do some things that I wanted to do that needed money. There was a wonderful counselor, a woman by the name of, and I want to say her name, you can edit it out if you like. Her name was Bonnie Hutchin. She was from the East Coast. And she just cared. She really had, there was a sense of being connected to what she was doing. And I dropped out of school for a while. I hadn't seen her for a couple of years. I was in college. And I dropped out of school, was kind of meandering. And I ran into her at a gas station, of all places, late at night, Saturday night. I think I was out partying, out running, had a couple buddies in the car. And we were both pumping gas at the same time. And I looked up and she looked up and we recognized each other. And she said, well, what are you doing with your life now? I kind of hem and hawed. I avoided the answer. Not much. I'm just looking at some possibilities. And she looked me in the eye in a way that very few people have at that age, as an adult, as a bit of a role model for me. And she said, no matter what you do, you stay in school. There was an impact in that stays with me to this day. And after that, I mean, it just sunk. And I think I went home early that night. I reflected a little bit. It seems very small relative to the larger scope of things, but it marked a turning point for me in some ways. And it kind of provided a lot of the incentive that I later developed, my own momentum in my life to work with people. I've done a lot of work with disadvantaged youth. I worked in a number of social and community programs over the years. It shifted something. There was something about the authenticity and the power of that contact that shifted for me, that changed something. So that's the one that stands out. It's really small. I mean, I've done a number of things over the years. I've had a number of experiences. I've had a number of challenges and successes and rewards. But that small, unlikely encounter on that Saturday night over a gas station pump with someone who was transitory in my life, it says a lot about the potential of how we can shift things in a minutia of an instant and not even know it. She, I'm sure, had no idea what that meant to me. She was just doing it. That was her spiel. That was just what she did. And so that's that.
Wow. Okay. And it sounds like, I mean, you say that she was a transitory person in your life. So I'm wondering who has been a more significant or I don't know, longer lasting, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a long period of time. But
Mm.
what other human being has made an impact on you and how?
Talking about personally or in terms of
Well, I mean,
where
personally or professionally or however it's transcended in your life.
part of my social justice orientation, I think it's a safe thing to say that I have, that's part of what makes me function and propels me. I had an older brother who never had the opportunities I had, and he died at a very young age. He was actually shot at 23. And so he had great potential. There was just a tremendous amount of life there, of vigor, of joie de vivre. And he never had a chance to fulfill that. But in the short time we knew each other, there was just something about his magnetism. He was a natural leader, and he was resolute, and he was noble, and he was principled, and he was very much kind of a father figure for me. My father's a whole nother story. And so those qualities, even though he was wild and he had been in a number of of difficult situations in his short life, there was just some valor about him that provided me with a model of what it means to not give up. And that's the key. I think that's the central organizing figure around how I've ended up where I've ended up at. Part of the tragedy of his young death was that it didn't have to be. And it was very much based on social circumstances. It was based on a combination of bad environment and bad parenting and poverty and very violent male culture that he became part of.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a long time ago, but it's still there. It's something that I treasure. I think in many respects, it's very important for me.
Mm-hmm. And so you've mentioned a lot about these circumstances and the social justice orientation. And I'm wondering how you have come to understand yourself, both in your gender and your power and your privilege.
It's a beautiful question. Thank you.
Thanks.
I see my social position, and this is, there were two things when I started college, because I'm a first generation university student. Even to this day, no one in my immediate family went to university. Two things that stand out for me in terms of, I began studying sociology and psychology. One is positionality. And so my position in the broader scope, the structure, the systemic realities of the way that our society is organized, predisposed me to a certain path. And that path was almost pre-written. And for me, I didn't, as if the choice has already been made. And the second thing, of course, is autonomy, is personal autonomy and personal responsibility. And so one of the things that's always intrigued me is how, given a certain set of circumstances, and this goes back to my interest in Sartre and fundamental choices, etc. Given a certain set of circumstances that seem predisposed for many people, and you know that being in a country that has many disadvantages, I would imagine. There are people who are born into a social position who will pretty much, that's it. There are no other possibilities. And so those two things together, I think, have provided me with an understanding of who I am. Most of my life has been about saying no in a lot of ways to the givens. I think it was Albert Camus that said the most powerful word in any language is no. And so I'm trouble. I mean, I always have been in terms of the givens of life. And I love that aspect of it. I really enjoy and self-admire that aspect about me. It hasn't been easy, but it's certainly been a choice that I couldn't have done otherwise. It just given where I came from and how I came from where I came from.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about some of those no's.
Yeah.
What do you mean by those?
Well, no to the street. I was born into an environment where if you were tough and you could do things that were not necessarily legal, if you could do those well, and that was your source of self-esteem. And so that was an easy one for me simply because of the circumstances. And at a very young age, I decided, well, in my late teens, anyway, early 20s, decided to do something else. Saying no to the fact that I come from a social environment background where many of the people I grew up with, and these are people of color, were twice as smart as me and went half as far. Not because of anything that was intrinsic in their ability, because their ability was outstanding. These were spectacular, gifted young men and women, but because the social conditions in which they found themselves ate them up, devoured them. Mm-hmm. So we talk about choice. I mean, choice is the other key to the autonomy piece. But for many of us, particularly those who are born with certain inherent disadvantages, it doesn't look like much like a choice. I mean, there's this tsunami of circumstance that causes tragedy and really is oppressive and exploitative and abusive. And so that has been a major orientation of my no as well. It's a whole lot. I mean, there's a whole bunch of no's. Traveling abroad. I've traveled for 3 decades now. I've been to I don't like to count countries, but I've been to 5 continents, and I've taught in 12 countries. And those were the kind of things that my generation, my peer group, my family, inconceivable that anyone would do that. And so that was a no to predestiny, I guess, is the choice. And I hope, like, I don't want to feel as if I'm self-promoting too much. This is very personal stuff, and it's very
Yeah,
important.
no. And it definitely doesn't sound like self-promotion. I mean, I'm asking personal questions. So it's not like I asked you about your work and then you launch into something completely different. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
Um, I'm just curious, when you say you teach, what level of education are you teaching at?
I began in, believe it or not, in the PRC in People of the Republic of China in '85, teaching at a university.
Okay.
And I've had a couple of, and I taught at the college in Japan. I've done mostly international school work. I don't know if you're familiar with the international school system.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yeah,
something called
so
the
like,
International Baccalaureate Program. Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
And so I'm an IB teacher. That's what I do. And I teach some very, I mean, there's a theory of knowledge course that's very cool in the IB program.
Hmm.
That is pretty much, I mean, this is introductory freshman, sophomore university classes. And we have kids that are just brilliant. I mean, that stuff doesn't phase them. They have that over lunch and don't even think about it. And so
Nice.
it really is a very special population, international school population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm used to speaking with people who work almost exclusively as adult educators, but just what you were saying. I sounds like you were still working with youth for some reason. So
I've been working with teenagers mostly, and I ran well, I taught college classes in California, community college classes for about 10 years before I started traveling, or during the interim, shortly after I got married. I was married in '92, and then taught at a local JC in California.
yeah, okay. So switching a little bit, I am curious how you found or met or encountered Gestalt. How did that part of your life come
Yeah,
together?
that's actually a bit of a tale. I managed to end up in Monterey, California, very cush, kind of comfortable couch community with a lot of very pleasant people and a very nice social environment by a number of circumstances that were quite unexpected. And so Monterey, of course, is about a 45-minute drive from Big Sur. So I'm fresh out of home. I'm away from home. I'm like 18, 19 years old. And people are going down to Big Sur on the weekends to the Gestalt Institute. And this is part of the whole set, you know, part of the, well, it's part of the era, part of the maverick cinema sensibilities of the time. It was the mid 70s, I guess. On Friday night and Saturday night, and possibly Sunday, after 12 o'clock, the baths, the sulfur baths, were open to the public and they were free. Or actually, I think there was a charge, but we used to sneak in. There was a fire trail that went from Highway 1 down to the baths. So we would sneak in late at night, sometimes 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and there'd always be a couple of the locals hanging out. People who'd done the workshops, they were there for a training session, and these amazing conversations were happening. I'm only 18 years old, right? I don't know much about any of this. And so I would eavesdrop on these conversations, and there was a lot of talk about Gestalt, about contact boundaries, about personal freedom, of all the things that were responsibility, all the things that were gravitating or propelling the human potential movement at that point. And so that was my first experience. It was kind of a voyeurist learning opportunity. And so later on, I was involved with someone who had trained and gone through several years of therapy with David Hoban, Dr. David Hoban, who was trained by Jim Simkin, who of course was one of the was Fritz Perl's co-therapist at Esalen. And through this person who pretty much saved me in many respects, it was I was still coming out of that very difficult period. I began to see David. And that was a relationship that lasted for actually until very recently, since I moved here. And that was my whole intro. And it couldn't have been a better introduction. It was intense, and it was in that whole confrontational, early kind of let's see where your resistances are at, and just continue to plod them until until they find their way. And so it wasn't an easy introduction, but that it just took off from there.
Hmm.
And then from David, I did some Gestalt workshops in Iceland. I worked with Christine Price and some other people. And also eventually the San Francisco Gestalt Institute later on, and Morgan Goodlander. It's been a wonderful friend over the years.
Yeah.
It's a pastiche, actually. It's a piecework quilt of these pieces. But my relationship with both David and Morgan have been long lasting over the years.
Hmm. And so aside from the relationships, what did you find in Gestalt itself that made sense for you?
The notion that the center of the universe is me, that everything springs from this sense of person, of organism, of entity that's sitting in this chair right now looking at you at this computer screen. Everything, that's the source of creation. And that's a true, I mean, it's true for everyone. It wasn't the fact that not only am I the origin and the creator and the eye of my universe, but so are you and so is everyone else. There is a fundamental, phenomenal, democratic notion in that. That is, the potential for it is just amazing. So if we are the center of our universe, then of course that means we hopefully have some say in our universe, which then gets back to that thing of responsibility, the questions of responsibility and autonomy and self-creation. So it was really that sense of having, through much of my early life, played the scripts that I didn't write. The script then became my own in some ways, independently. And this was the power of early Gestalt. Of course, more recently it's had become, I believe, more relational and more context aware and more field oriented. But the early Gestalt was that sense, well, this is you, what are you going to do with it? And really everything, I mean, Pearls was the one that said 90% of everything we do is projection. Well, if 90% of everything we do is projection, and we have to wonder about who's running the projection screen and what responsibility do they have for what it is that's being projected. Mm-hmm. And what will we do about it in that sense? What will I do about it if that's the case? So that opportunity to be, on the one hand, who I am, and on the other hand, to know myself. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's an affirmation. I think there's a tremendous amount of power in that, as opposed to being interpreted or to being set up on some kind of a program that's going to manage your behavior, or more the intrusive kind of managerial approaches in psychology.
It's interesting. I mean, it is sort of like that classic, is it self-determination or is it fate? Because you have this individual who, of course, has to come into their potential, and then eventually they run into the outside world and all of those circumstances and all of those restrictions and constraints that are real in the outside field that you were talking about. So, but it's interesting, if there is no individual, if there is no support for the individual, I understand that there is no self acting in the world. So.
Well,
it's just interesting the way that you framed it. I was like, oh, okay.
Is it understandable?
Yes. Yeah. I'm just kind of like, oh, okay. It's 7 o'clock in the morning. Bear with me. So, yeah.
One of the things that has been defined as freedom, and I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre, is that freedom is what we make of what's been made of us. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, we have this facticity, this situation that for whatever reason we have to contend with. And how we decide to do that is a matter of choice. And the only thing that supports choice is nothing. This is the whole notion of, and I think Jean-Paul Sartre in many respects was onto some very Eastern notions of who we are and how we make choices. But there's no basis for believing that I have to make a choice in any one direction other than my volition and my freedom to make that choice. And there's not even anything supporting that choice independently of my own values, which are self-chosen as well. Mm-hmm. And so at the core of being is nothingness. I mean, the existentialists have been saying that for a long time. And of course, it's been part of the Eastern perennial philosophy for thousands, hundreds and thousands of years.
And it's also a fundamental part of the Gestalt philosophy. So.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find seductive about Gestalt, by the way.
Mhm. So
So does
that
that,
actually is my next question, which is what have you done with what's been given to you? I mean, how have you worked with this, especially the Gestalt part, but I mean, what projects have you structured in your own life and how do you work?
well, I consider myself a practitioner, and I guess self-assured enough to say that. I've been running groups. I run intercultural groups, as I mentioned before. If there, if there's anything that kind of outlines the contour of what I've been doing for the last 40 years of my life, it's a combination of social justice, intercultural groups, and to some degree, Gestalt therapy, Gestalt principles. Gestalt doesn't naturally lend itself necessarily to intercultural dialogue, but I think there's a great place for it there. And so it's a little bit like any other modality or any other approach. If you can find room for it, if it fits, if it's not being forced, and if it's producing some level of well-being from the application, then of course make room for it. And so I do some Gestalt in my groups.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and again, this is kind of a return for me. Gestalt has been a very personal practice for me, not one that I've attempted to do as a professional, as a therapist. It's been much more kind of a personal journey. But I'm seeing the confluence, the agreement between social justice, intercultural group dialogue, and some of the basic Gestalt principles, especially the expansion of the relational field work that's being done in Gestalt. It just
Mhm.
makes sense. And so
Mhm.
one of my sub missions right now is to try to see where that can go in Gestalt and maybe reclaim some of my own training. And I've had a lot of it over the years and my own therapy over the years, and integrate that into an intercultural dialogue
Hmm.
format.
I am curious how you said it's, I think, something to the effect of it doesn't lend itself to intercultural practice.
Mhm.
I'm wondering where you see that and if you could say more.
Primarily because of the intrapsychic
Right.
phenomenological bias. And of course, it began as a phenomenological approach to human potential and human growth. We have certainly put that into a broader context. I mean, there's a lot more going on in contact, what it means to make contact, the differences, the importance of making contact with difference, and the relational field, and the therapist-client relationship, the ground out of which that comes, and the field that it creates. There's it's a bit of a stretch when you take basic Gestalt practice, some of the orthodox vintage stuff like the open chair dialogue, the sensory awareness activities, the body emotion connection, and you put that into a intercultural framework, making that transition, making that wash among, and most of the groups that I run are, sometimes I've had as many as 10 or 12 different cultures in one group, and international education is like that. So there's got to be some type of preliminary work that makes that have meaning and make sense. You just can't rush in and someone can't read a Gestalt handout the night before and the next day expect it. Because so much of that is embedded in culture. I mean, the notion of there being an autonomous individual who acts in their own growth. I mean, that's very much a Western individualistic assumption that in many
Yeah,
cultures.
that makes sense for a lot of white guys in a hot tub in Esalen.
Thank you, it does. And a lot of white guys from up north where things are run according to those principles. And it
Mhm.
fits perfectly into a capitalist framework as well. The autonomous consumer who is seeking
Yeah.
self-pleasure, the hedonism of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, that kind of thing. So,
And it's interesting that even you put yourself relative to the other guys in the hot tub in that they were paying to be there and you didn't.
yeah, thank you. Well, that's
So there's that issue of access to those
what,
levels and kinds of knowledge. Like it does matter.
and as I pointed out, most of the impact we have on each other, we're never aware of. I just don't think we rarely go back and say, what you said to me about that, that just made so much sense. And it affected me. We don't know that. And of course, the guys in the hot tub didn't even know I was there half the time. So yeah, those are the things that happen. There's got to be some unfoldment in that, some emergent arising meaning, significance, because I've just seen too many things happen that never should have happened along those lines. That wasn't part of the program, the larger social program. So back to my point, if you take that very individualistic kind of center of the universe orientation of Gestalt, particularly the earlier Gestalt, and I found it liberating because I'd come from a place where almost nothing was me. It was always about, did I fit in? Was I being who I was supposed to be? If you take that and then bring it into a group context where there's value orientations that are fundamentally opposed to that, or just don't get it, don't have you. What do you mean you only think about yourself?
Simply collective cultures.
Yeah, it's collectivism. That's exactly what it is. One of the aspects of collectivism. And so how do you make that transition? And that's one of the things I'm working at. Once there's enough trust and the cohesion is good, I personally have found once that kind of, I'm here to be with you and not for me, for us kind of thing. Once that transition is made, then the boundaries become very flexible. And you can interject. I can interject a lot of things that at the beginning just wouldn't have, people would have walked away. So that's the big challenge. That whole epistemology of Gestalt, the Western epistemology, how do you fit that into a multicultural setting where you've got all kinds of differences in the perceptions of what's going on? There's very little consensus in terms of what's actually happening in that group, and primarily because of culture-based projections. I mean, most of our projections with people of difference, they're all cultural, and they really do stem from that socialization that is embedded in culture. So opening that door, that's an entry point, you see. And one of the beautiful things about Gestalt, though, that fits into that is that we learn through difference. We learn by bumping up against difference. And so allowing that to take place in a way that is palatable, that's beneficial, then opens up this amazing area of possibility for how people begin to understand themselves and others. And that's the real potential of intercultural dialogue, is that it's such a learning ground. It's such a it is a social Rorschach. I mean, it's just all there. But we have to set the tone and have the supports and make sure that the mood is proper and that people feel included, and that we get through some of the nonsense about difference first before we let that kind of reflective learning process take place. It's exciting. I think that it has a lot of potential for answering some of the questions that we are really struggling with now around difference, inclusion, and equality. One of my fantasies is that these kinds of groups, if they can take place on the community level, we can have some community practitioners who only need like some basic training, could generate themselves for social change. We could actually have the basis through which people locally in the community of local connections begin to rub up against people of difference who aren't like them. And through that, if the rubbing is done in a way that is challenging but inclusive and supportive, there's a whole array of possibilities that begin to open for social change at the local level. So the kind of local populist Gestalt / democratic / social change model, I think, is one of the things that I'm kind of leaning towards, figuring out how we might be able to do that. I think local community change is just huge, just so important.
So do you have examples? I mean, you've talked about challenges. Do you have any examples from your experience of things that you would say are highlights or successes or moments that have stayed with you where you've been like, wow, this worked? Either with an individual, with a particular group, or a community context?
Yeah. The dialogic aspect of Gestalt, I think it has a lot of value for group process. And I mean, in the beginning, of course, there was the performance-oriented kind of Peirlesian, I'm going to show you what I can do with this. And then you can, once I've done it, then you can tell this person what you saw, etc. We've really shifted away from that into the relational dialogue. And so I've found over and over, and this is not an article of faith, it's actually I think an evidence-driven conviction, that if you provide the right context, the right supportive context for people to get together, to begin to figure out where they're at with each other, that dialogical, with the respect, what's referred to now as radical respect with some of the Gestaltists, that begins to open up possibilities. And once those possibilities open, so dialogue, I think dialogue is probably the linchpin in much of this. And then we can get into more of the personal work where people are actually exploring bodily sensations, talking about unfinished business, whatever the laundry list is for Gestalt technique. And that's just as valuable, but our anchor continues to be in relational dialogue within an intercultural context. So that you and I may be having a dialogue and there may be good mutual support going on, but there's also all this baggage that we hope is coming up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering if there's a particular example of work that you've done where that baggage has come up and been worked through. I mean, do you want to tell any stories about some of the work that you've done?
Well, there's always, there's a social justice thing in terms of power in groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I have done, and the empty chair thing, it's like, if a group is not, and I remember this as a case in point in particular, a group was still kind of dealing with inclusion, and there were some males that were being quite dominant in the conversation, etc. And increasingly, one of the females, I think she was actually Asian, was withdrawing. And so I brought her into the conversation. I remember saying, well, what's going on with you? And she said, I just don't feel like anyone wants to listen to me. It's just not, I'm not going to speak if no one is giving me their attention. And so we did a little body stuff. Well, where do you feel that at? Well, I'm feeling some tightness in my stomach, and I'm feeling a little tenseness in my shoulders. And so I just said, would you like to give a voice to that? And there was a tremendous shift in her sense of empowerment in that moment when she began to talk from that tightness in the stomach and the tenseness in the shoulder. I don't like being here because no one is listening to me, especially these men here who don't even see me. And so that opened up a whole series of exchanges about what was going on with the power dynamics in the group and how we might be able to do it, because this particular participant was as much valued as anyone else. How do we make sure that this is inclusive? How do we use that particular instance as a way for making this a more democratic, dialogue-driven, relational experience for everyone? And so we're connecting, of course, the personal to the social and then back to the personal. And then later we check in and say, well, how are you feeling now? What's going on? Well, I'm breathing again. I'm a little, the normal stuff that happens when you've actually been listened to and seen. And so that there's just lots of room for that.
Right.
Yeah.
And about yourself, do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community? I mean, does that mean anything to you?
Thank you for asking that. Only in spirit at this point. I mean, I spent some time with the San Francisco Institute. It's been a while since I've been there, and that I think the people who I was there training with and involved with have disbanded. So it's been transitory from time to time. I mean, one of the things about Gestalt workshops is that they tend to be these really significant get-togethers where folks can do some very good work, and then they disband, and then we move on to our other lives, whatever that is. And I've been traveling so much, I don't really have a community to identify with. So not for longer than a couple of years at a time over the years. Nothing permanent, primarily because of the transitoriness of the groups I've been involved with. And workshops, of course, are always for a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I feel like I could go back to any one of those trainers, whatever they were doing at this point, and just slide right into whatever they were providing. There's that sense of being able to go home. It's a bit of a stretch, but yeah.
Interesting. And how would you say at this point that Gestalt in particular has affected you as a person? I mean, given this whole road that you've been down.
Yeah. I would hope, and again, this is all self-narrative is always a bit of Hollywood, that it's unavoidable.
Well, it's storytelling. It's fun though. There's something to it for sure.
At the end of the day, one story is as good as another. It's the one that keeps your attention. It's the most important.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of work around creative adjustment in cross-cultural situations. So because I've lived abroad so much for so long, I would hope that some of those basic principles of organistic self-regulation have stuck. And I don't get culture shock anymore. It's amazing. I mean, something happened about 5 years ago. I just stopped experiencing culture shock. It doesn't mean I don't have off days, but
Right.
no worse than the days I would have no matter, I could be back in California. And so creative adjustment, I think, is probably one of the things that I continue to fall back on almost intuitively now, in terms of, well, this is my environment, this is my need. How do I make those two find a wedding? How do I get them to the altar together so that they actually produce the good things about what I need at this point in a way that is appropriate for the environment?
Mm-hmm.
And that's cultural learning as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like to refer to culture shock as a safe emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that I need to promote in the intercultural dialoguing groups, is that we can put this on the table, and we can certainly, our differences can be vocal and even heated and passionate, as long as we know it's a safe emergency and that it's part of an adjustment, creative growth process.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that same thing that applies to me personally when I'm living abroad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I think of culture shock, I think of, the conscious practice of creative indifference and
Mhm.
just becoming really aware of the expectations. And, that gets into the prejudices and the biases and the things that lead me to feel that difference and to have different expectations of a circumstance that I have no way of knowing beforehand what I'm walking into.
We're
So
so busy doing what we're doing that we don't see what we're doing.
exactly.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I like the creative indifference. Just the
Well, I said creative adjustment, actually.
No, I know, but I'm hearing that, and I do
Oh, that's
understand that's what happens when you're there. But
yeah.
in terms of working, with people who are in sort of trans or intercultural circumstances, it's I usually come up in my own life and in some of my work with the, okay, well, where is that just being with the creative indifference and not expecting? Because
You're talking
that sort
about
of, yeah, it's like a preventive measure to stop the shock from happening.
it always. Yeah, no, if I stand back and I detach a little bit and I just self-observation neutralizes everything. It's the alkaline acid. Absolutely.
Yeah,
But
it's the idea of unbiased phenomenology, which of course is pretty impossible, but it's a nice
well,
ideal.
Gurdjieff talked about self-observation a lot, and he seemed to have been onto something about how that suspends the game, and we actually can access maybe a broader understanding of things
Mm-hmm.
by this relentless. And J. Krishnamurti talked about the same thing, I think, in a much more subtle, soft way, caring way. But that takes all the fun out of things, though. We don't get a chance to, well, we learn. We learn. There's no doubt about it. But if I'm indifferent, if I'm not reactive, there's not a lot of juice there for me to take home to use as part of the soup of my learning experience.
That's
As long as it doesn't as long as I'm not overwhelmed by it.
mm-hmm.
So
No, I didn't mean passive indifference. I meant specifically the creative indifference.
okay,
Yeah.
are you talking about the 0 point? This is kind of a theoretical question, but the zero being creative indifference being the 0 point.
Just sort of the having no expectation, the practice of non-judgmental just being.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
good. Well, that would indicate one of two things for me. Either that you've lost all your buttons, so there's nothing. I would hope that someday I have no buttons, but that's certainly not me in the present. Or the other thing is that you somehow have reached this state of awareness that you kind of, one is fluid. I become fluid, and there's nothing to rub up against. I'm not there, as they said about Bob Dylan for so many years.
Yeah, that's my own potential for an excess of confluence. So Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing. If you
Yeah.
don't, if you
It's
don't have,
that being too open sometimes, but it works.
yeah, no,
It's a choice.
as long as you know that, as long as we know, as long as I know that it's not me that
Hmm.
is being too open. There's no me there to be open. There's only experience. There's only it's Taoism, right? There's only that stream of experience. And so to stand back and just kind of, wow, that's an interesting thing.
Hmm.
That's a nice place to be. But if your core values or some of your rough edges are being tormented, as they
Right.
so often are, and particularly I think the further we get away from our home culture. I've spent some time in East Asia, for example, where some days it seemed like people were just going out of the way to make me upset. I mean, that's part of the projection, right? That's part of
Hmm.
it. Because there was so much that I was bringing to the situation that was about my own expectations, which are culturally embedded. And that's the safe emergency. See, we can stand back from that and say, what's happening here?
Hmm.
What is it about me that is creating this? And how am I writing the script, kind of thing? And
Yeah.
that's where the self begins to unravel.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm really speaking a lot. I hope I'm not tiring you.
No, no, not at all. I do have one last question though. These things sort of naturally come to a close, actually. So the last question that I have on my list is pretty much what's next, either for you in your own work or your own projects. I mean, you've spoken about the development sort of those community and social justice integrations. I'm wondering if there's anything specific that you wanted to talk about, and also what you think is next for Gestalt, if that's different than your own projects.
Yeah. Um, well, what I'm working on, as I mentioned, I think it's always bad luck to talk about what you're writing, but I'm banging out an article that has to do with the expanded field, relational dialogue in the expanded field, and how that is a very fitting place, particularly at this time of crisis. We haven't even spoken about crisis. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. This unprecedented point of a breaking in the streams, where some real choices have to be made about where we go as together in our present level of stress and challenge. So what I'm doing at this point is trying to bring together what I've learned, hopefully, and what I understand to be the interconnection between intercultural dialogue and social justice issues and Gestalt principles. And I'm working on an article to try to get that into Gestalt Review or the British Journal of Gestalt or something, someone that will pick it up. Um, in addition to that, I'm organizing a workshop at the San Francisco Gestalt Institute that has to do with cultural competency and how that's related to Gestalt in diverse settings, which increasingly happen to be the case in multicultural settings, particularly for human service workers these days. Some level of intercultural competency, I think, is essential, unavoidable.
Hmm.
And if we can somehow hook that on Gestalt or hang that on Gestalt hooks, then of course that makes much more sense to those people who are involved in the Institute. And it helps me to keep my perspective as well. So those two, one is the theoretical, the article, and the other is the workshop that I'm planning to do. I
Hmm.
I do consulting work. I haven't mentioned that. I've consulted for a couple of schools and a couple of organizations around intercultural communication patterns and around cooperation, cross-cultural cooperation in workplaces. I have a site online. It's kind of antiquated now, but so I can always go back to that.
Hmm.
That's those three things I think are probably
Hmm.
my my game plan at this point. See where they
And
lead.
in broader strokes, do you think there's a next for Gestalt as an abstract sort of collective idea?
Yeah, I think we're upon the 11th hour in terms of Gestalt actively integrating issues of class, race, and gender, issues of inclusion, questions of mutual support to get out of this abyss that we found ourselves in around too much difference, around too much lack of confluence, around too much individuation. Some of that's being done. Lynn Jacobs is doing some good work, I think, and Deborah Plummer's Radical Respect, and Price Robinson has done some work, I believe, around social structures in the phenomenological field kind of thing. So that's beginning to bubble up, but I don't see it being connected and I hate to use this word, especially for Gestalt, I don't see it being connected to a clear agenda, a clear mission statement in the Gestalt field, like a shared vision of where we need to go along those lines. And it doesn't mean that we should devote the entire effort in Gestalt communities towards social justice, but we find a place that's meaningful and effective for social justice issues. Because if we ever needed it, and if we ever are looking at the dire consequences of not adopting it, the time is now. And there's just so much hanging in the balance right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my hope. And if I can contribute to that in some small way, I'll be grateful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that articulating these things and naming them and making them explicitly part of decisions and programs, it makes a difference. I mean, people have said, "Oh, yeah, we're always doing that, and all of the values are included." But it's not necessarily true. I mean, I think it is definitely the time to be explicit. Otherwise, there is that continued complicity.
Yeah, and there's an urgency upon us. I think there is really a sense of now or never,
Mm-hmm.
and there may very well be a never. If we really are on the brink, I believe, and I feel that intuitively. It's not just a rational, intellectual, evidence-based, and there's lots of evidence there. But part of the field, and I think this is a really important part of understanding the depth of field work, we intuitively, and Jung talked about that, the collective unconscious, we intuitively, I think, have a sense of the emergency of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so we take whatever we have at our disposal and we try to interject. I try to interject what I can in terms of some sanity about how we're going to live together into
Mm-hmm.
our little acre of life that we have. And if that's Gestalt, then that's what I think I have some responsibility for.
Okay. Well, is there anything else at this point that you would like to add to this particular conversation?
No, I'm pretty much stimulus response. I just respond to questions, and I have no independent thoughts about anything, actually. I just want to tell you how grateful I am that you're doing this project. I think it's so vital.
Oh, thank you.
Gestalt has been such a, in some ways, a turbulent, unruly historical development, but so meaningful and so much impact. I mean, there's just been so many waves of influence that is generated from those early days. Of course, in New York, first of all, and then later in Big Sur and Cleveland and the other institutes. If we can give it some semblance of a narrative, of an overarching narrative that makes sense and inspires, we hope to some degree, and motivates, and also is a source of self-reflection, then you've done a lot, and your crew has done a lot. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. And if it's okay with you, we will leave it here for now.
Thank you very much.